Hi, this is a new lesson for my online art school. In the previous tutorial we talked about the big light, the big shadow, halftones, reflections and highlights. So today we need to get some practice and I will show you how to draw a plastisphere from life using graphite pencils and paper as a surface. So let's begin. First of all, of course, we need to grab a graphite pencil. I do not recommend you to use something that is really soft or, on the other hand, really hard. So I think an HB graphite pencil will be perfect, or maybe B or 2B, but not softer or harder. The first thing we need to do with our pencil is sketching out the big form of the sphere, the big shape of it, the big silhouette. So basically we need to draw a circle almost in the center of our paper. But I would recommend you to draw it a little bit higher to the upper edge. Make sure that circle doesn't look oval, it has to look like a circle. If you need to adjust its form, use an eraser. After that, let's find the border between the light and the shadow. You can see it on the picture. The border is an area or transition that separates the big light from the big shadow. So make sure you do it correctly, precisely, and you find the right place for the border. After that, we need to sketch out the cast shadow. Again, in the previous tutorial I talked about the cast shadow. It's a shadow that our plastisphere casts on the surface it's standing on. But in the very beginning we need to draw an oval. It has an oval form, not circle but oval. So let's just quickly outline that form, that shape, that silhouette. I'm not hatching in the very beginning, I'm using just lines, very light lines, and I'm not pressing my graphite pencil a lot. So after you're done with this quick outline, we start hatching. Again, in one of the previous lessons I talked about hatching, different techniques, types, and today we're going to get some practice in hatching as well. So let's start hatching from the shadows, and not just shadows, but from the border between the light and the shadow. It's easier to start working from the shadows. You can use contour hatching. So basically when you hatch you need to follow the form of the sphere, like this spherical form. So the hatching has to have this spherical direction. Again, in the very beginning we don't press our pencils really much, so the hatching looks pretty light. And we slowly make it darker by adding more and more graphite, more and more layers of hatching. And do not forget to change the direction of the hatching a little bit. So we need to make a very smooth and very soft spot of the shadow. Don't do big gaps between hatching, don't do that 90-degree hatching that I showed in the previous lessons. So don't do these basic mistakes beginners usually do. Carefully, slowly work on the form. Try to look at the plastisphere. I'm drawing from life. You can also find a plastisphere and draw it from life, or you can find a spherical form like an apple or a bowl or something that has a spherical simple shape. Because it's always better to draw from life, especially when you learn drawing basics. You need to practice from life, not from pictures. So I'm drawing in the shadow, I'm darkening in the shadow. I work mostly in the shadow in the beginning, and again we start from the border between the light and the shadow, because as I mentioned, the border is the darkest part of the core shadow. So the sphere has a core shadow, and the border that separates lights from the shadows is the darkest area. It's pretty simple. Then we need to start darkening in the cast shadow. Again, remember that the cast shadow is a lot darker in the place where it starts from. So actually right under the sphere, the cast shadow is a lot darker. Then it gets some reflections and becomes slightly lighter. But the cast shadow generally is darker than the core shadow. And you see now that my core shadow looks a bit lighter. It has a reflection, reflected light. And the cast shadow is pretty dark, but it's not black. Remember that we don't use really soft pencils and try to avoid really dark darks, yeah? So don't do the shadows simply black. The halftones and values are very different from the very light to the very dark, but not just black and white, they're different. Then we need to start working on the backgrounds. It's always easier to surround your halftones, your big lights of the sphere, with darker tones, because then it's easier to see them. That's why we need to kind of separate our sphere, our big form, from the paper. And for this purpose, we start darkening in the backgrounds. Again, try to follow the shape, the form of the sphere, like work a little bit around the sphere. You don't have to completely darken your paper. You can work only around the sphere, because again, we need to make the background slightly darker than just white paper. Then it's easier to judge the halftones of the sphere. And then when we are done with this background, we start working on the halftones. Again, try to start working from the border between light and shadow. The halftones over there will be the darkest halftones. Remember the basic rule: lights are always lighter than the shadows. So halftones, which belong to the big light, will be always lighter than any part of any shadow. So even the darkest halftone is going to be a lot lighter than the strongest reflection in the core shadow, let's say. I carefully darken the halftones. I'm trying to make them lighter than the shadows. I'm not pressing a lot, and again we use this contour hatching. So we're trying to follow the form of the plastosphere. I'm not really darkening in the highlight. Remember, we have highlights, the lightest part of this object. So I'm working around the highlight. I'm not really working in the highlight area. Halftones can be pretty dark. They are not white, and they are different. Again, as I mentioned, we don't have just white and black. We have a big variety of different tones, of different values. So halftones are not just white. They can be pretty dark. Again, remember when we talked about the light source. When any object or any part of the object turns away from the light source, it becomes darker. So look at the sphere. The part that turns away from the light source becomes darker. So the halftones will be darker at that part which is further away from the light source. So that further part is a lot darker. The highlight, it's closer to the light source. That's why it's so light. But that area that is closer to the border between the light and the shadow is going to be darker not only in the shadow, but also in the halftone. So halftones and shadows are both darker nearby the border between the light and shadow. So at the very end, I'm trying to look at the overall of the drawing and maybe do some corrections here and there. For example, most likely we need to darken in the shadows. So make sure that the shadows are darker than the lights. Make sure that the cast shadow is darker than the core shadow. Make sure that the border between the light and the shadow is the darkest area in the core shadow. Then you can darken in the backgrounds a little bit. But remember to avoid really black areas. We don't need to have something really black. We can have something that is dark, like pretty dark, but not black. Okay, I think I'm done with this drawing. It was a quick drawing and we tried to draw a very simple basic form today, a plastosphere. So it's really important, and my big suggestion for you is to practice. So try to find either a plastosphere or an object that has a spherical shape and draw it. Spend 2 hours or maybe 3 hours, but not more, to make this exercise. You'll train the hatching techniques and you'll improve understanding of the light source, big lights and big shadows, reflections. You'll figure out how it all works together when you actually start drawing. So in the next video I'm going to show and explain how to draw a plaster cube from life. See you then!